IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. You know, if you're older than me and you went to college in the 1980s, you would probably do well to learn the Russian language, maybe learn about Soviet polity, and if you were a political scientist or a social scientist, you might actually learn about the Soviet Union's armed forces, and you would seem to have a career path set for you because the Soviet Union was never going to fall. Now, of course, the Soviet Union fell, and a lot of people had to find new sources of employment. In 1991, when Soviet power basically collapsed into itself, it was not obvious that there would be an immediate recovery. But within a decade, the newly independent Russia bounced back and has got the world's attention since then. And studies of Russia's armed forces are now important again. Last month, the US think tank RAND recently published a study called Trends in Russia's Armed Forces, and it's a pretty fascinating study. And to discuss this report, I have with me Anirudh and Pranav. Anirudh, you track Russia. Tell us, first, what is this report really about before we get into the details? It goes into budgets, it goes into Russian strategy, but just give us a broad overview first.
So, this, as the report's name suggests, is broadly about where Russia's armed forces are coming from, but more importantly, where they're going. And it uses a lot of budgetary analysis to kind of pinpoint the general trajectory that the armed forces are likely to follow. It gets into some detail over the historical trajectory, the way that the budget has gone up and down over the last few decades as Putin has become more and more expansionist on the international domain. But I think that the most interesting things the report has to say is the way it systematically talks about the way Russia has changed the strategy of its armed forces. The way that modernization is playing a role in its armed forces, its new perception of the threats around it and the actions it's taking in order to deal with them. So in that sense, it's a very interesting look into the Russian military mind, and more importantly, the way that Russia thinks about its ever-present greatest threat, right? NATO.
So an old Sovietologist would basically have one number to work with when looking at the Soviet Union's defense budget back in the day. Russia's defense budget reporting has become much more granular since then.
Yep.
Are there some key takeaways from this report on how Russia is spending on its armed forces?
So Russia, quite conveniently for defense analysts such as ourselves, has a habit of actually coming out with official Ministry of Finance numbers for its defense budget. So we generally have a fairly good sense of how big that number is and the big heads under which that money is being spent. Another big source that we have for this information are, of course, independent organizations as SIPRI, and you have numbers that the Russian government expenditure numbers actually submits formally to the United Nations. So these are all dollar denominated, and these are written down under the same heads and categories as the US armed forces or any other armed forces in the world. So you get a very good sense now of what exactly Russia has been spending on. And the trend that the authors have identified is that there's been almost a six-fold increase since the beginning of the 2000s to the present day in Russia's spending in terms of real dollar value. Though that's not reflected in the ruble value because of the fact that the ruble has fluctuated in value due to the way that, due to oil price shocks, due to sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, and the fact that people are just not interested in investing in Russia the way they were in the early 2000s. So it's very interesting to see broadly just how much of a priority modernizing their armed forces has been to Russia. The trend that we are seeing over the last few years is there's more of a expenditure on personnel, which the authors argue points to an increased interest in like training and deploying the armed forces in new ways, which we'll probably get to later on in the report. And the overall trend they're seeing in terms of like arms procurement going forward is that there's going to be an increased emphasis on the ground and aerospace forces as opposed to the Russian Navy, which they seem to have essentially given up on as a lost cause for modernization.
Yeah, so it's interesting to me that Russia spends on personnel, this isn't pensions we're talking about. We're talking about training. We're talking about adding new capabilities. What are these new capabilities? How are they different from the capabilities that the Soviet Union fielded?
So let's continue with the idea of the Navy, right? So I mean, the Soviet Navy was a fairly major component of its global power projection capabilities. But modern Russia is just not as interested or just not as capable of maintaining these large-scale, long-term naval deployments in blue waters. Part of the reason is, of course, that their Cold War era fleet is running into serious maintenance issues now. But also because the threat perception and the needs for Russia, its outlook as a global power, do seem to have changed. As bombastic as they might be sending out their cruisers and sending out Admiral Kuznetsov, I think, during the Syrian civil war, all of these are very deliberately meant as power projection exercises. If you actually look at the way that they've been spending their money, it's fairly obvious that the Russian Navy is much more interested in just limited coastal defense capabilities. The kind of ships they have right now are equipped with long-distance cruise missiles that can get deep into enemy territory potentially. So clearly they're maintaining some sort of power projection capability, but that's only in the neighborhood. They are not interested in blue water power projection, or at least they're not doing power projection through the Navy as much.
Yeah, I mean, if I was Russian, it would make sense for me to consolidate my Navy, to get rid of older crafts, focus my budget on newer ships, and to use my Navy in my littoral waters, and to use them to project power in the near abroad. Is that broadly what the Russian Navy is doing today?
You've actually hit the nail on the head. That's more or less it. And it's, since you mentioned consolidation, this is a little bit of a tangent I think it's worth getting into. One of the major factors of the Russian defense industry's relative success over the last few decades has been what happened after the Soviet era. There were over 1,500 enterprises related to defense manufacturing, it turns out, and about 2/5 of these were immediately privatized by, of course, individuals tied to Yeltsin and Putin and so on and so forth.
The whole messy privatization of the 90s.
And you also had less messy privatization and a continued relevance of public-owned institutions. But now what we're seeing under Putin is that there's a very systematic attempt to kind of get all these corporations together. So you have your United Shipbuilding Company, United Aviation Company, which include things like Sukhoi, the famous Sukhoi Design Bureau, and so on and so forth. And I would have thought until I actually read this report that consolidation was an absolutely great thing, and it must be responsible for so much streamlining and just so much elimination of overcapacity. But it turns out that's not the case at all, because there's a lot of old-timey Soviet bureaucrats still there, or their descendants, and these guys are essentially just interested in making sure that it's their sub part of the corporation that gets the defense contract, that is their design that's improved. So a lot of these issues still really need to be ironed out before leaping to the conclusion that streamlining has really worked for Russia.
Okay, so we just touched upon the Navy, but there's this one Russian weapon system that makes headlines, the S-400. India's buying them. Turkey's buying them. So the S-400 is like one of their core exports. But how are Russians developing their own air defenses at home? Pranav, can you tell us something about it?
So the S-400 is a very good topic to start off with. But before that, we have to understand the overall strategic context in which the S-400 is being deployed in large numbers. And for that to happen, the Russians still maintain the Soviet-era bombers, starting from the Tu-95 Bear, which is the turboprop engine bomber, which is very slow. It's not been modernized to that extent that it can stand up to modern-day standards. But however, the Russians also have the Tu-22 Blackfire jet bomber and the Tu-160 Blackjacks. In 2018, the Russians actually modernized their Blackjack bombers so that you could extend its strike range. So one side, you have Russians increasing the modernization process to extend the life of these bombers, correct? And second, they are increasing the number of investments in the deployment of their air defense systems and sensors. So according to this report, because the Russians have vulnerabilities in their bomber capability, what the Russians would do is use long-range strike cruise missiles, which the Russians have a very large number of them, and they have a good quality number of them. They would use these very long-range cruise missiles in order to strike enemy forces, and at the same time, they would deploy air defense systems with extremely good and precise radar capabilities to defend some of Russia's most important cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and so on, right? So the S-400 has been deployed since 2017. They have about 21 divisions of the S-400 missiles, and they have over 700 launchers of the S-300 missiles. So they're deploying a large number of them, and the investment in the air defense capability has not only been in quantity, but it also has been the quality, because one of the features of the S-400 is not the missile and the launcher itself, but its ground-based radar capability, right? So the Russians understand the vulnerabilities that they have in the long-range bomber capability, which is the reason why they're improving their sensors, which is the reason why they're improving their air defenses in order to stay capable.
That's interesting. The underlying strategy in both the naval and aerospace domains seems to be to focus on this kind of long-range defense as opposed to just getting your bombs out there the way the Americans do it, right?
Yeah. The Russians have also developed the range of fighters. They have the Sukhoi T-50 or the PAK-FA, which they've built 9 prototypes of, and they've recently started deploying the actual product.
So hang on, let me just try to weave this into the broader strategy they're looking at. So you're saying that they focus on long-range air defense and even bombing capabilities. They don't necessarily have that much kind of tactical bomber, like short-range capabilities.
Well, they do have tactical bomber short-range capabilities. So if you look at the Soviet-era strike bomber that they were using, which was the Sukhoi Su-24 flanker, it has been replaced slowly by the Su-34. It's a 2-seat strike bomber which has seen action in Syria. So one of the headlines that started getting listed in the news in around 2015 was that Russia is using this new Su-34 2-seat bomber, which is compared to the American Strike Eagle, the F-15E Strike Eagle. So the Russians are also developing their capabilities in that area with more precise tactical bombers and tactical bombs with better sensors.
Okay, so now we know about long-range bombing. We know how tactical bombers operate. What are their? So I think that the T-50 that you mentioned it's a 5th generation fighter jet, right?
Yes, it's comparable to the F-22. We haven't seen much of its operations. We have seen the Americans show off their F-22 and their F-35, which have both operated in Syria. The Russians are yet to show their capabilities, and the Russians are really using Syria as a proving ground for most of their capabilities.
Okay, so it's quite interesting to see how this capability or doctrinal preference ties into their limitations in terms of defense manufacturing and also into the way that their ground forces are structured. So one thing I've learned, and obviously since this is all really new space to me, broadly what we're looking at is maneuver and fire, right? So both of these are things that the Americans as well as the Russians play with. And the Russian, whereas an American detachment, as you would famously know from Hollywood movies, generally has the ability to call in like Air Force strikes because they have that joint operations capability with the Air Force. Russian ground forces instead tend to carry their own artillery with them. So they don't have the ability to work with the Air Force yet. But at the same time, their own ground detachments tend to have more sort of capabilities than the average American detachment. So they have somewhat better maneuverability because they have their own vehicles that go along with them, and they also have dedicated artillery detachments that go along with this ground force, in addition to radar support, air defense support, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it's kind of interesting to see how the Russians have taken into account their capabilities, what they know of how the Americans fight war. And they're focusing on mobility at a much more granular level. So these are called battalion tactical groups, which operate more or less independently. And one thing that the authors of the report point out is that we'll know that Russian jointness is starting to advance when we see them using this sort of joint operations within the ground forces at a brigade level as opposed to a battalion level. which I think makes a lot of sense. But then, of course, everything makes sense to me because I'm new to this space. But yeah, that was pretty interesting.
Okay. It's really interesting to me that a lot of this is not necessarily the behavior of a superpower on the rise, consolidating your navy. The reliance on missiles as opposed to combat aircraft, or rather the reduced dependence on combat aircraft, and the attempt to make ground forces more self-sufficient. But what is the future of an armed force like this? This seems like intelligent retrenchment in a sense. So where do the Russians see their armed forces, say, 10 years from now? What are the capabilities they want?
So it seems fairly obvious to anybody who is actually reading the reports that Russia's whole pretense of being a great power and the American paranoia accompanying it are more narrative and psychological games than anything else. I think that given the current status of the Russian economy, they've recently come out with a new acquisition plan for the army, which is actually far less optimistic than the last one that came out in I think 2011 or so. And I think all of these are admissions from the Russian leadership that, look, I mean, there was a point when this bombastic military served our purpose, but we are reaching a point now where we're actually starting to feel the effect of the sanctions. They want to spend more on infrastructure. They want to spend more on social spending because I think they've started to feel the political bite. Broadly, the overarching trend that I've seen, it seems partially the whole obsession with becoming a great power, once again, the ghost of the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. But I would also say that it's very important to keep in mind Russia's own threat perception when going about this whole effort, because as you pointed out, all of these are actions of retrenchment, not of power projection. I think that trend of retrenchment, streamlining, focusing on meeting their security needs, on addressing the threat perception, are going to start to dominate over the next decade or so. But Russia is still going to be fairly active in the international space because that is just how Russia is. That is, it's tied into their whole image as a responsible global power and so on and so forth. And especially as it becomes more and more obvious to the world that the Russian Navy is no longer even the equivalent of the Chinese Navy, that the Russian Air Force is not capable of maintain the same technological edge over its competitors as other air forces are. I think those are going to remain important for Russia.
So that's a pretty good overview of what Russia's armed forces are right now and what they are likely to be in, say, a decade from now. But we're talking about Russia, and we can't really talk about Russia without talking about nukes. So this is where I want to bring in Pranav, and I can just see the grin on his face. Pranav, tell us, what does the report say about Russia's nuclear forces?
So the report about Russia's nuclear forces is very much connected to the episode that we did with Kia Lieber and Daryl Press on Friday, where the Americans now have very good capability to detect and to probably make Russian forces very vulnerable. And this is also a concern that the Russians have. We know that the Russian early warning satellites are degrading. And more recently, they launched 2 early warning satellites, new ones, in order to sort of make up for this lost capability. But yet, this is not sufficient enough to have a robust early warning system. And the Russian mobile missile system, which we know comprises of the Topol and several others, is very vulnerable because these are large, heavy, noisy machines which go with the radar system and so on. So I think the report says that because of these vulnerabilities, Russia would rather use a launch on warning system, because if they are attacked, then there is a likeliness that their nuclear forces will be vulnerable and will be destroyed. And instead of losing these nuclear weapons, they would rather launch them on warning. That's one of the derived conclusions in this report, which I found very, very interesting.
All right. Well, there's one more trope that's invoked whenever people talk about Russia's nuclear forces, which is this escalate to de-escalate. The idea that Russia will use nuclear weapons in a limited way, coercively, to end a conflict that's not going in its way. Does the report address escalate to de-escalate?
Yes. In fact, that's a very hot topic in the United States, and the report somewhat tries to address this question. They point to a 1999 journal article which talks about a de-escalation strategy, and they mention that this concept has been brought up from time to time, but they do not attribute this as a strategy of the Russians.
Well, that's good to know, because almost any scholar of Russia will tell you that there's no evidence that this is actually Russian strategy. Okay, anyway, thank you so much. This has been a very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
At least for me. Do you guys want to share your Twitter handles, Anirudh?
Mine's at AKANISETTI.
I'm Duke _ not Newcomb.
And I'm Aditya R22. Thank you so much for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.
Janice, what do you think couples did before TV was invented?
I don't know, go for walks on the beach, long drives, fancy dinners, have more sex maybe?
But what did we do when we decided to move in together? We debated between the Chromecast and the Fire Stick.
We gave up on sleeping early so we could stay up watching true crime shows.
We got ourselves 3 cat babies.
And basically became the cutest couch potatoes around.
Okay then.
In case you guys still haven't got it, we are a TV crazy, Netflix loving, binge watching Mr. and Mrs.
I'm Anirudh Kuha.
I'm Janice Sequeira.
And if like us you snort TV for breakfast, lunch and dinner, this is the podcast for you.
Tune in every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app or wherever it is that you get your podcast from. This is
Mr.
and Mrs.
Binge Watch.